Geneva. It began the way so many consequential ruptures begin, with 5 words nobody in the room had been prepared to hear. Not because of their profanity, not because of the volume at which they were delivered, but because of their complete lack of necessity. The bilateral meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had been characterized in the diplomatic press as a last realistic opportunity, a final high-stakes attempt to arrest a trade conflict that had already consumed billions of dollars, closed factories across the American Midwest, and driven 2 of the world's most deeply integrated trading partners to the edge of sustained economic confrontation. The venue was neutral ground in Geneva. The table was long. The cameras were live. For the first 20 minutes, the structure held. Trump spoke first. He was expansive, aggrieved, and familiar in his delivery. He raised complaints about Canadian dairy access restrictions. He raised the question of energy dependency. He described what he called Canada's chronic bilateral trade surplus, a figure that does not exist in any verified dataset, but has never required verification to serve its rhetorical function. He cited no data. He named no specific American company that had been materially harmed by the conflict. He spoke as though the preceding 18 months had not taken place. Then Carney began his presentation. Within 10 minutes, the meeting was finished. Not because the Canadian Prime Minister elevated his voice. He did not. Not because he issued a threat of any kind. He made none. Carney, a former central banker with the composed emotional register of someone who spent decades reading economic catastrophe without blinking, began reading aloud from a document that every official present would subsequently describe as the most consequential piece of diplomatic material they had ever witnessed across a table. It was not Canadian data. It was American data, compiled by American government agencies, certified by American statisticians, page after page of documented job losses, shuttered factories, farm bankruptcies, and federal subsidy expenditures, each item tied directly and traceably to the Trump administration's own trade decisions. 247,000 American jobs eliminated by retaliatory measures from trading partners. 14 agricultural commodity categories that had lost their entire Canadian market access. 112 manufacturing facilities closed across the Rust Belt alone. And then the figure that appeared to shift the atmosphere in the room. American taxpayers were now spending more in federal agricultural subsidies to compensate farmers for the loss of their Canadian export revenues than those same farmers had ever earned from Canadian trade in the first place. Carney offered no commentary. He added no editorial framing. He read the figures, citing the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of Agriculture, and the Federal Reserve's own industrial production reports. He identified states by name. He named congressional districts. He named the auto parts facility in Michigan that had closed 7 months earlier, eliminating 412 jobs. He said the name of the plant. He said the name of the town. He named the parent company. Then he moved to the next page. Trump interrupted on 2 occasions. The first time he challenged a specific job loss figure. Carney looked up from his notes, cited the precise BLS report by name and date, and continued reading. The second time, Trump said the numbers don't tell the whole story. Carney, without pausing, replied, "These are your numbers, Mr. President, from your agencies. I'm simply reading them back to you." That was the moment. According to 3 officials seated at the table, the temperature in the room changed. Trump's face moved through a sequence that people who have observed his public career for years have learned to interpret. First, disbelief. Then something that looked like rapid internal calculation. Then something more unguarded. He pushed his chair back from the table. The sound traveled clearly through the otherwise silent room. He stood up. He looked at his chief of staff. He looked at the door. He looked back at his chief of staff. And then he said 5 words that every recording device in the room captured with complete clarity. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by a country that doesn't matter." He walked out. The door closed behind him. Mark Carney, still in his chair, still composed, his notes still spread in front of him, did not move. For 5 full seconds, no one spoke. The Canadian delegation exchanged glances. The American officials sat motionless, several of them with their mouths marginally open, the particular physical posture of people who have just observed something and understand that its consequences will arrive before they can be fully calculated. Then Carney did something that no one in the room had anticipated, and which would prove in its own quiet way to carry more weight than any tariff schedule or diplomatic measure that followed. He continued his presentation. He looked down at his notes, located his position, the Michigan Auto Parts Facility, 412 workers, and kept reading. He completed the manufacturing data section. He delivered the energy figures. He moved through all 5 segments of a 15-minute briefing that had been prepared for 2 heads of government and was now being delivered to 1 empty chair, 1 stunned American delegation, and every camera that had been set up to record a joint meeting. He was no longer speaking to Trump, who had left. He was speaking to the record, to the cameras, to the American public, to the historical account of what had occurred in that room. And he finished. He closed the folder. He looked directly into the nearest camera lens, and he said 12 words that would appear on the front pages of every major Democratic World newspaper within hours. He walked out of a meeting. We'll walk him out of our economy. Then he stood, gathered his delegation, and left for the airport. The press conference that followed was short. Carney took 3 questions. Will there be consequences? There are already consequences, he said. They began before his car reached the airport. Is this the end of negotiations? We were never the ones who left. What message does this send to the world? That the numbers exist whether he's in the room or not. By the time Trump's aircraft had cleared Canadian airspace and reached the eastern seaboard, the consequences had already been deployed, not over days or weeks, in 4 hours. Here is what Ottawa executed in the time it takes to fly from Geneva to the coast of Maine. First, Canada activated a 200% tariff on a targeted set of American agricultural exports, the same 14 commodity categories Carney had been presenting when Trump walked out. The legal instruments had been drafted, reviewed, and approved in principle months in advance. They were not a reaction assembled under time pressure. They were a pre-positioned instrument waiting for a trigger. Second, Ottawa suspended all joint energy infrastructure agreements, pipeline maintenance protocols, cross-border electrical grid coordination, natural gas flow management systems, the quiet operational infrastructure that keeps American border states heated and powered through every season. The suspension was not a complete shutdown. It was framed as a maintenance review that reduced energy flows by 40% while remaining within the technical boundaries of existing bilateral agreements. Grid operators in Michigan, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Minnesota received automated notifications. Delivery volumes would be reduced effective immediately. Restoration was contingent on the resumption of bilateral diplomatic engagement at the leadership level. The language was precise. It did not reference tariffs. It did not mention trade. It simply stated that energy flows would not be restored until the party that had terminated the meeting returned to the table he had walked away from. Third, Canada revoked preferential transit access for American commercial shipping through the St. Lawrence Seaway and Canadian Arctic waterways. American shipping operators moving cargo between Atlantic ports and Great Lakes industrial centers received notification that transit fees would increase by 300% within 72 hours, and that priority scheduling would be suspended until further notice. The Great Lakes shipping corridor moves more than 200 million tons of cargo annually. The Seaway is the only navigable route for ocean-going vessels to reach the industrial ports of Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee. There is no geographic alternative. The corridor is defined by physical reality, not policy preference. Fourth, and in terms of structural consequence, the most significant of the 4, Canada formally invoked the Mutual Economic Defense Clause of the Berlin-Ottawa Compact. This is the mechanism that triggers automatic compensatory measures from Germany and the European Union when either signatory faces coercive economic conditions from a third party. The invocation was procedural in form, but immediate in implication. Every retaliatory American tariff imposed in response to Canada's measures would now be automatically offset by European trade access provisions. The primary instrument Washington had deployed for 2 years, the capacity to impose economic pain through targeted tariff escalation, had been structurally neutralized by a four-nation defense architecture that activated on a preset automated trigger. 4 measures, 4 hours, each one surgically calibrated, each one legally airtight, each one modeled for maximum economic impact on the American side with minimum disruption to Canadian operations. And each one, as the world would discover within days, drafted months before the Geneva meeting had appeared on any diplomatic calendar. Because the walkout was not an unexpected development to the Canadian side. It was a scenario. Scenario number 9, to be precise. In the days that followed, it became clear that Carney's strategic planning team had invested 8 months developing a 17-scenario response playbook covering every plausible form of American escalation. A walkout in the opening 5 minutes. A walkout mid-presentation. A walkout following a personal insult. A complete suspension of diplomatic communication. Targeted tariffs on specific Canadian sectors. A full energy embargo. Each scenario came with a pre-built response package, an economic impact model, a diplomatic communications framework, and a deployment timeline. Scenario 9, counterparty abandonment of bilateral engagement, had been finalized 6 weeks before the Geneva meeting was scheduled. The 200% tariff schedules had been drafted and reviewed. The energy suspension protocols had been stress-tested against 11 different American counter-responses. The shipping access revocation had been examined for legal exposure. The Berlin-Ottawa invocation had been pre-cleared with Berlin and Brussels. When Trump stood up and delivered those 5 words, he did not disrupt Canada's strategic plan. He activated it. Warren Buffett, asked about the Geneva events in a rare on-camera interview, delivered an analysis that cut through the surrounding policy noise with characteristic directness. He said he had observed people walk out of negotiations across 70 years of business life and had developed an ability to read the difference between 2 distinct types of departure. The first is the walkout of someone who has already secured their position, composed, deliberate, designed to apply sustained pressure. The second is the walkout of someone who has lost control of the room, who cannot counter the argument being made, who cannot absorb the discomfort of being confronted with facts that have no available rebuttal. He watched the footage from Geneva. He said it was the second kind without question. And then he added a detail that kept strategists in Washington awake that night. A 4-hour retaliatory package, he said, is not a reaction. It is a pre-positioned weapon. You cannot draft a 200% tariff schedule in 4 hours. You cannot model energy flow reductions in 4 hours. You cannot coordinate with European treaty partners in 4 hours. What you can accomplish in 4 hours is open a prepared folder and execute the contents. That folder existed before the meeting opened, which means Carney's team had not only anticipated a walkout scenario, but had specifically modeled it, which means the data presentation itself, the Michigan plant, the Iowa farms, the 14 commodity categories, had been calibrated to the subject areas most likely to provoke Trump's departure. Which means Carney did not simply anticipate the walkout. He may have deliberately engineered the conditions that made it occur on his timeline rather than Trump's. The consequences cascaded at a pace that matched the speed of their deployment. Agricultural futures in the 14 targeted commodity categories fell between 9% and 17% within 48 hours. Soybean producers in Iowa, dairy cooperatives in Wisconsin, wheat growers across Kansas and the Dakotas were confronting the immediate operational reality that their most geographically proximate export market had been closed by a tariff rate high enough to function as a complete embargo. The chairman of one Iowa farm cooperative told Reuters, "Canada was 38% of our export volume, not our largest market globally, our closest. The relationships we built over 30 years were gone in 4 hours because the president could not stay in a room through a presentation." Energy costs in American border states spiked within hours of the 40% flow reduction taking effect. Natural gas futures in the Midwest jumped to levels not recorded since the previous winter's peak demand period. Vermont's governor convened an emergency energy security call and announced the state was approximately 2 weeks from implementing rolling conservation measures. Michigan's governor was more direct. Her state runs its factories on Canadian electricity and heats its residential areas with Canadian natural gas. The president had just walked away from the country responsible for keeping the lights on. She said she needed someone in Washington to explain the strategy because from her position it was not visible. The shipping access revocation produced compounding logistics disruptions throughout the Great Lakes industrial corridor. Auto components delayed at the Seaway bottleneck forced the shutdown of 2 assembly lines in Ohio within 72 hours. Steel shipments rerouted through more expensive American coastal ports added an estimated $6 per ton in transit costs, a margin that 3 mid-size manufacturers stated publicly would require production cuts before the quarter ended. The Great Lakes Shipping Association estimated the total cost of the transit revocation at $900 million per month if the conditions were sustained. A logistics executive in Cleveland described it in terms that did not require elaboration. The Seaway isn't a convenience. It's an artery. You cannot reroute an artery. Financial markets processed the Geneva walkout and the 4-hour response package through the direct arithmetic of risk repricing. The Dow fell 431 points on the first trading session following Geneva. Analysts attributed the decline not to the specific measures themselves, but to the speed at which they had arrived. Speed implied preparation. Preparation implied additional measures already loaded. Additional measures already loaded implied that every future American trade action now carried an unknown retaliatory risk that no pricing model could quantify in advance. A Goldman Sachs analyst wrote in a client note, "The 4-hour response timeline fundamentally alters the risk calculation for American trade policy. Previous retaliatory measures were measured in days or weeks. This response was measured in hours. We are revising our American trade stability assessment from uncertain to structurally unstable." American domestic politics fractured at a speed that paralleled the Canadian response timeline. Governors of agricultural states demanded emergency federal intervention within 24 hours. Iowa's governor held a press conference at a grain elevator and stated that his state's farmers had lost their most geographically accessible export market because the president walked out of a meeting he was losing. That, he said, is not a trade strategy. That is a reaction with a price tag, and his state was being charged. 3 Republican senators from border states issued a joint statement characterizing the walkout as a strategic failure with immediate and concrete economic consequences for American workers and producers. 2 additional Republican senators, both from agricultural states facing competitive re-election, released individual statements notable primarily for what they omitted. Neither named the president. Neither defended the walkout. Both called for immediate resumption of bilateral engagement at the leadership level, language that implicitly acknowledged Trump was the party who had broken off the engagement. The business community directed its frustration at the White House with an unusual degree of unified directness. The National Association of Manufacturers issued a statement that was a single sentence in length. "You cannot resolve a trade conflict by leaving the room where the resolution was available." The Business Roundtable convened an emergency session with 47 chief executives and released a statement characterizing the walkout as the most damaging individual act of the administration's trade policy tenure and demanding immediate, unconditional re-engagement with Ottawa. A Fortune 100 CEO told the Wall Street Journal on the record, My company employs 12,000 people, whose positions depend on the US-Canada trade relationship remaining functional. The president exited the meeting, where that relationship was being repaired, because he found the content uncomfortable. I do not walk out of meetings because quarterly numbers are unfavorable. I sit in the room, absorb the information, and address the problem. That is what leadership requires. International reaction was rapid and damaging to American credibility with aligned nations. Allied governments that had been watching Geneva as a potential inflection point drew the same conclusion simultaneously from the same footage. Canada was operating at a strategic altitude the United States was not matching. Japan's foreign minister described Canada's response as a model of strategic preparedness, reflecting the highest standards of governance under sustained pressure. Germany's chancellor offered a single observation: Canada was ready. That tells you everything about who has been leading this confrontation and who has been improvising responses. At least 4 additional nations, according to diplomatic sources, requested formal briefings on the 17-scenario methodology within 72 hours of Geneva. Canada had not simply retaliated. Canada had produced a replicable template for structured retaliation that converted American unpredictability from a strategic asset into a documented liability. Which brings us to the question that now occupies every serious analyst in Washington. If Scenario 9, a walkout occurring mid-presentation, produced this level of coordinated, preloaded, legally unassailable retaliation, what do scenarios 1 through 8 look like in practice? What responses are loaded into scenarios 10 through 17? What specific triggers activate them? The uncertainty itself has become an operational weapon. Every future American trade action, every tariff announcement, every diplomatic provocation, every public threat now carries the embedded risk of activating a Canadian response package that will arrive faster, land harder, and strike with greater precision than anything Washington can assemble reactively. In that Geneva conference room, with the cameras still recording and the empty chair still visible in the frame, Mark Carney delivered the closing statement that will define this chapter of economic history. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform emotion for the cameras. He looked into the nearest lens and stated what he had been stating for the previous 15 minutes. The documented truth, supported by American data, presented with the precision of someone who had spent decades ensuring that the numbers were correct before speaking them aloud. He had prepared for every possible ending. The one that had just occurred was not an interruption of his strategy. It was the activation of it. He walked out of a meeting. We'll walk him out of our economy. He closed the folder. He stood up, and he walked out of the room. Not in anger, not in retreat, but because he had delivered every word that needed to be said. The cameras had captured all of it, and the response was already deploying 4,000 miles away before his car cleared the building.